Good evening. My name is Michael Satlow from the Department of Religious Studies and the program in Judaic Studies. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Gary A. Anderson. Professor Anderson is the Hesburgh Professor of Catholic Theology in the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. He specializes in the religion and literature of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, with special interest in the reception of biblical literature among later Jews and Christians. He is a fellow of the American Academy for Jewish Research and has held fellowships from, among others, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Philosophical Society, the Lilly Endowment, and the Institute for Advanced Study at Hebrew University. He has also served as president of the Catholic Bible Association. Professor Anderson has written extensively. His early books were on ancient Israelite religion. One, Priesthood and Cult in Ancient Israel, he co-edited with our own Professor Saul Olian. He then worked on a few books on the reception of the story of Adam and Eve among early Jews and Christians. I've used his book, Genesis of Perfection, Adam and Eve in Jewish and Christian Imagination, in one of my classes. The students like it. It is through his last two books, though, that Professor Anderson might now be best known. In 2009, he published the book Sin, A History, a fantastic title and a great book. And in 2014, the book Charity, The Place of the Poor in the Biblical Tradition, both with Yale University Press. Both were extensively lauded. These books seek to unearth and elucidate the surprising intellectual history of concepts that have played a pivotal theological role for both Jews and Christians. To me, what marks both of these books as distinctive is Professor Anderson's rare ability to engage and read the Bible academically as an ancient text located in a culture distant from our own, while at the same time showing the value of such a study for the modern reader. If that were all not enough, I should mention that I had the privilege of having Gary as a colleague at the University of Virginia some years ago. I learned much from him, both intellectually and professionally, and personally as well, and remain indebted to him. Although perhaps considering the theme of this talk and that of our workshop, Jewish Attitudes Toward Wealth and Poverty, indebtedness might not be quite the metaphor I'm looking for. It's my honor also to acknowledge the generosity of those who made this talk possible. The Ruth and Joseph Moscow Endowment in Judaic Studies was established in 2005 in loving memory by their children and grandchildren. The Brown Judaic Studies Monograph Series, the Department of Religious Studies, and the Royce Family Professorships of Teaching Excellence. Our sincere thanks to all. My thanks also to our excellent support staff who've been working diligently behind the scenes, Susan Rottenberg and Rachel Van Metter. And if we can actually show our appreciation to them at this point publicly, that would be a good thing to do. Today, Professor Anderson will talk on metaphysics or morals, the place of charity in Second Temple Judaism. Please join me in welcoming Professor Anderson to Brown.
Thank you so much for those very kind remarks, and I'm very honored to be here, and obviously have many good friends on the Brown faculty, and I have enjoyed this conference a great deal. The first slide maybe is just by way of introduction. It won't be formally part of my paper, but I think introduces a theme that's very important for the study of charity, and especially the issues that come into the secondary literature, certainly if you're studying the subject of charity in Second Temple Judaism and the New Testament to early Christianity, because charity, I think, really surprised me as a very contested category in modern research, and the contestation is grounded in the events of the 16th century. I came to appreciate this when I read a book that was actually deeply influential on my own research, perhaps an unlikely book, a book by Stephen Greenblatt titled Hamlet and Purgatory. It's one of these books I was reading because I was interested in Greenblatt and Hamlet, not because I thought it was going to be useful for my research, but ended up being fantastic for my research because the book really is poorly titled. Hamlet is the last 2 chapters of the book. The book is really about purgatory, and actually a very sympathetic and profound theological examination of purgatory, partly because of Greenblatt's own life experiences as he was writing the book. If you read the preface, you'll note that his father had passed away during the composition of this book, and as that became incumbent upon him, of course, to say Kaddish in synagogue, this was something of a spiritual crisis for him because he is a secular Jew. But he embarked on this mitzvah in any event with considerable zeal, and studying purgatory within the realm of early modern Catholicism, he says, at least in his preface, was very influential on his own Jewish religious life. I found this image from his book, and the reason why this book is good in terms of illustrating the contestation, and maybe just finish one thought on that. The first chapter of Greenblatt's book is all about Protestant and Catholic debates about the character of charity in the 16th century, which do carry forward into New Testament scholarship, really to the present day. But you probably couldn't tell exactly from this image why this would be the case, because I've clipped off the very bottom of this image, but below this image right here is a picture of the souls in purgatory who are being raised from purgatory to the Olam Haba, the world to come, and the actions that, the prestigious actions that make this journey possible are the sacrifice of the Mass, which you can see in the upper left-hand corner, and then the giving of alms there on the right. The pairing of the sacrifice and the Mass and the giving of alms is deep within the Christian tradition, but goes back to Second Temple Judaism. Perhaps our first clear example of this would be the Septuagintal translation of Hosea 6:6, a famous text cited in the New Testament and in rabbinic literature, in which Hosea says that God desires chesed, mercy, not sacrifice. I like to translate that. I like chesed, not just sacrifice. I think that captures the sense of the text best. But the Septuagint translates chesed there, eleos. Eleos is related to the Greek word eleomasinai, which comes into Romance languages as limosina, and into English as the word alms. In other words, charity to the poor. The origin of alms, that's simply a corruption of a Greek word, goes back its function, its salvific function, to the Jewish Greek translator of Hosea 6:6, probably in the 3rd century. What Jan Houston noticed about this translation, which I think is quite significant, is that it's a peculiar word for the Greek translator to use for chesed, somewhat singular in the Hebrew Bible. And as Houston notes, chesed in the Bible, especially in this text, probably means covenantal fealty. It expresses a vertical relationship of the individual to God. Eleos is a horizontal activity that has God isn't in the picture. It's mercy shown to another human being. Why does the Septuagint do this? Houston argues that the term chesed here is under the influence, the biblical term chesed is under the influence of its evolving rabbinic meaning, gimilut chasadim. And so with the Septuagintal translation, we can see a witness to the enormous sea change in the Hebrew language that's happening in the Second Temple period. But it's not just the Septuagint. The correlation of sacrifice and charity can be found in Ben Sira and Tobit as well. And it's not necessarily a concept that's linked to the diaspora. I think that's why the evidence from Ben Sira is so important. Even with the temple standing in Jerusalem, actions of mercy towards the poor were understood as actions similar in stature to that of sacrifice. But here's an image actually I would like to stop on for just a second. I have a great kind of amateurish fascination with art history, primarily because of my interest in the history of biblical exegesis. I love to go to the medieval and Renaissance sections of museums and look at biblical stories which are almost never rendered the way in which the Bible depicts them, and try to figure out in my own mind what it is within the theological tradition that has informed the painting of this scene in this fashion. Well, this scene can't be found in the Bible anywhere because it's a scene about Joachim and Anna, the traditional non-biblical parents of the Virgin Mary. I saw this in the National Gallery in Washington. Frequently what happens in art history is art historians are not trained in theology, and often what they say about the theological content of a picture verges on the embarrassing. And in this instance, it wasn't only that the image itself was misunderstood, but the title was wrong. So I put the title here simply as I saw it in Washington, D.C., Joachim and the Beggars. And if you look on the right, you can see, lo and behold, Joachim there distributing pieces of bread to the poor. But if you look immediately to the left of Joachim, of course, you see Anna, who at the very same time is donating, presumably, a jar of grain to the priest there in the temple. And the way in which they are joined, the English expression here I think is quite good, joined at the hip. I think our artist wants to present them almost as a single actor, in a single action of helping the poor and donating a gift to God. In that sense, this is not that different theologically than what we see here, the correlation of the Mass to offering alms to the poor. Here we can see it realized in this fictive, we might want to say, Old Testament Jewish setting. But it's very striking to me that the person who labeled this loses the significance of Anna altogether. And I think this is a kind of pars pro toto, as it were, for the study of generosity in Second Temple Judaism and certainly early Christianity. The reduction of the act, as I like to say it, to a horizontal plane, as though the only actors involved are the donor and the donee. Whereas what's distinctive about charity in Second Temple Judaism, and certainly the way it's going to be received in Christianity, is the vertical dimension that falls out almost completely or is problematized. That's the virtue of going back to the book by Greenblatt. It's problematized because the vertical dimension, at least as traditionally expressed within the Christian tradition, was something that in the 16th century became, at least for half of the Christian world, impossible to assent to any longer. That is, the power of the charitable act like the Mass to raise those in purgatory to eternal life. So that by way of background, perhaps the best place to explore the supernatural character, as I like to call it, of the virtue of charity is the story of the rich young man in the Synoptic Gospels. It's found in all three of the Synoptic Gospels. And what I want to suggest this evening is the way in which this story is portrayed and the way it's understood is going to reflect the loss of this vertical dimension, certainly among the traditional expositors of the story, but the story is deeply consonant, in fact, really unintelligible apart from its Second Temple Jewish origins. The story is Jewish through and through. In this tale, Jesus commends the piety of this young man, but urges him to take one more step. The man has just told Jesus that he has fulfilled all of, or half of the 10 Commandments, which Jesus commends as very good. But then he says and adds, go sell what you own, give the money to the poor, and then the key clause, you will have treasure in heaven. Though these words can still register amazement among readers, their familiarity, at least for some, poses a challenge. Indeed, what often strikes the modern reader as odd in these words of Jesus is not so much what he asks, that is, go sell what you own, but the reward that he attaches to what he asks for. You will have treasure in heaven. I remember one time when I was lecturing on this subject in Boston, a very learned priest came up to me after the lecture and told me of his inability to answer a parishioner's question after Mass in which this text from the Synoptic Gospels had been read. What the question was put to this priest, why does Jesus add this reward? You'll have treasure in heaven. Wouldn't it have been better if he simply said, go sell what you own and give your money to the poor? Full stop. By appending this motivational clause, the necessary condition of the moral act seems to be fatally compromised. After all, a charitable deed ought to be grounded in a concern for the other. It shouldn't be tainted by any sense of self-interest. Now, on the face of it, this is a formidable critique. The concern for selfless acts of charity has been at the heart of both Jewish and Christian theology from the very start. But somewhat surprisingly, this particular text did register this level of anxiety among ancient readers. The concept of a heavenly treasury has been something of an embarrassment to modern persons. In his most recent book, Peter Brown writes this: "When one turns to present-day scholarship on this theme, we find that the idea of a treasure in heaven is surrounded by a loud silence. Neither the Catholic Dictionnaire de la Spiritualité nor in the Protestant Theologische Realencyclopädie is there an entry on trésor or shots." And of course, for Brown, he's just writing a 400-page book and now another 250 pages on this subject. He's obviously shown the reader that this is a category of immense significance within the early church. But why is it then that the major research encyclopedias don't even register this as an entry? He goes on, for purposes of false humility, I say false because now I'm going to tell you, in the next sentence praises my book, which made me, of course, quite delighted, as a good treatment of the treasury in heaven. So at least I have the authority of Peter Brown, if not Michael Satlow's kind words about my contribution. Anyways, I say false humility, and I didn't put it here, but I mentioned it verbally, so the humility truly is false. I think it's fair to say, and it will be my contention this afternoon, that the concept of the treasure in heaven, or a treasury in heaven, Otsar Shebashamayim, marks the difference between ancient and modern conceptions of the charitable deed. One of the reasons that modern readers focus so much attention on the altruistic motives of the rich young man is that we view charity in a purely horizontal fashion. It's as if the only players to be considered are the donor and the donee. On this view, two concerns rise to center stage: the motivations of the donor and the effectiveness of the donation on the recipients. This latter concern raises the important question of how our charitable efforts contribute to the creation of a more just society, something that this conference has been exploring with great animation. An extremely, of course, important dimension in modern discourse about poverty. But oftentimes this leads to the folding of charity in both religious and secular discourse into concerns for social justice without remainder. So I should emphasize my point here this afternoon is not to impugn social justice, by no means. But because social justice as a category is primarily concerned with the equitable distribution of the finite goods of this world, it can't capture the sacramental role charity plays in Second Temple Jewish texts. I hope you won't mind my using a Catholic category, sacramental, to describe the way in which this material works in Jewish material. What I mean by that term is to introduce this important vertical axis within the action. It's this vertical dimension that has fallen out of our theological imaginations and constitutes the major reason why Jesus' motivational clause to the rich man has become something of a stumbling block to many modern readers of the story. In order to appreciate why charity has this vertical dimension, it'd be useful to look again at the origin of this very concept, that is, the treasury in heaven in the Jewish scriptures. Perhaps a closer reading of these texts can restore some vigor to a dimension of our theological imagination that is greatly atrophied. And here's the key text. This text is huge in the New Testament, though rarely cited, but stands behind, I can name at least 4 or 5 prominent texts missed by almost every New Testament scholar who examines them, for reasons I won't go into. It doesn't have the significance subsequently in early Christian thinking, probably because righteousness there, tzedakah, as we'll see in a moment, which can mean charity, is rendered dikaiosune in Greek. And so that Jewish register of meaning is lost to the church fathers. It was not lost, certainly, to the creators of the New Testament. And this verse is very important in a number of passages. In any event, what I want to suggest is that the notion of a treasury in heaven begins from a close reading of this proverb. Let's begin with one key detail. That's the opposition here, which I've put in red, between treasures of wickedness providing no benefit, but righteousness delivering from death. Clearly, the worry here is how to avoid some tragic event that could be encountered in the future. We should hasten to add that the book of Proverbs knows nothing of a bodily resurrection. Accordingly, we should understand the phrase delivers from death, tatsil mimavet, as referring to an experience of salvation from this worldly calamities, such as a terrible illness, see Psalm 30, the premature death of one's beloved children, see Jacob's remarks at the end of chapter 37 in Genesis, or the infirmity of old age. Indeed, the last example, I think, captures the sense of the proverb best and puts a fine point on the radical character of its teaching. Let me give it a slightly modern paraphrase to bring out its counterintuitive nature. However confident you might be in the funds you've accumulated in your IRA, in the end, they won't provide the help you might expect. But if my financial assets then are of negligible value, on what should I rely? To answer this question, we have to attend to the opposition in this proverb between righteousness and wickedness. In the book of Proverbs, these terms constitute a natural antinomy. Any proper interpretation of the proverb must be able to explain what the specific type of opposition is implied between the A and B lines. And here we must note that righteousness, tzedakah, in the Hebrew of the Second Temple period, takes on the technical sense of charity to the poor. Now, there's a footnote here of Victor Hurwitz of the Hebrew University has argued, I think, quite well that the term has that sense already in the Bible itself. It's unfortunately a very underread article, probably because it's written in modern Hebrew, but I don't want to, go to the mat for its the simple sense of the proverb itself from the hands of the original writer. It'll be enough for this evening if we simply accept the fact that tzedakah in the Second Temple period, certainly by the time we get to Ben Sira and Tobit, it's unarguable, means charitable actions. With this in mind, we could paraphrase our proverb this way. Treasuries of wickedness provide no benefit, but charity to the poor delivers from death. The next question we would want to ask, though, concerns this phrase, treasures of wickedness, otzorot resha in Hebrew. Modern translations often render this simple genitival phrase as treasuries gained by wickedness. Though this is a possible rendering of the Hebrew genitive, it does not provide a very good antonym for the concept of charity that we find in the B line. Let's recall that wickedness and charity, resha and tzedakah, are understood as natural opposites, and any translation worth its weight must do justice to this antinomy. So I would suggest that rather focusing on how the wealth was accumulated, that is, the popular modern rendering, treasuries gained by wickedness, this is a more modern concern, it would be better to focus on what the wealth was capable of doing, a pre-modern and what I would suggest metaphysical concern. One might think that saving money for the future will allow one to navigate safely the uncertainties that the future might reveal. But our proverb, as I've already mentioned, rejects this common sense. The only thing that you can really count on, this proverb wants to suggest, are the monies that you've given away to the poor and suffering. At this point, we could paraphrase our proverb, the goods you hoard in treasuries, that's, I think, the sense of the otzorot resha, won't provide the benefit you expect, lo yo'ilu in Hebrew. Only charity to the poor, tzedakah, will deliver you, tatsil, from future difficulties, mimavet. Okay, we're almost ready to return to the story of the rich young man, but just one more detail has to be examined. As is frequent in Hebrew poetry, an idea that's expressed explicitly in the A line often has to be carried down to the B line. So Psalm 100 verse 2, make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. worship the Lord with gladness. In this case, the reader must carry the subject of the A line, all the earth, down to the B line, where it is the presumed but unexpressed subject of the verb worship. The same thing I want to suggest takes place with our proverb. As we have noted, hoarding and giving to others are natural antonyms. If the former defines one type of treasury, hoarding that is, it's possible that the second does as well. That is, what we give away also funds a treasury, this treasury, though not being earthly, but rather heavenly. And with that in mind, our proverb neatly could be translated, paraphrased, the goods you hoard in earthly treasuries will provide you no benefit, but the charity that you give that funds heavenly treasuries, this will, in the end, deliver you from unsaid calamities. Now, confirmation that the proverb was read in precisely this way can be found in the writings of a famous sage of the Second Temple period known as Ben Sira. I could also turn to Tobit, but for the interest of time, we'll look at Ben Sira. Rather than storing money in earthly treasuries where it can go to rest, Ben Sira says this: lay up your treasure according to the commandments of the Most High, and it will profit you more than gold. Store up almsgiving in your treasury, and it will rescue you from every disaster. There's the Tatzil Mimavet, and storing up almsgiving in your treasury. Well, that's not in the proverb, but what I've just tried to suggest it very much is in the proverb if we've read the proverb the way I have suggested. With this simple paraphrase, then, that I have suggested for Proverbs 10:2, the concept of a treasury in heaven is born. And what's important to attend to is the counterintuitive nature of what our proverb teaches. One might have thought that a safe future is going to be secured by storing away wealth for the future. But in this proverb, this notion is radically inverted. Our proverb contends that the only wealth that's going to be reliable is that which is acquired through charitable action. So the way to true security is through giving away exactly those goods that the world deems of value. Okay, with this in mind, I think we're prepared to look back at the gospel text that we began with. That is the story of the rich young man found in Mark chapter 10. This chapter comes at the end of a section of Mark's gospel known to New Testament writers as the travel narrative. It documents the final trip that Jesus is going to make from the very northern reaches of the Galilee, Caesarea Philippi, to Jerusalem, where, of course, he will spend his final week. This narrative is framed by two stories of Jesus healing blind men. Very important literary notice to take note of. That's because the whole section is about the counterintuitive nature of Jesus' own self-understanding. The disciples are going to be spiritually blind to who Jesus is and require divine revelation to be able to see it. And so on either side of this story, we have Jesus healing physically blind men to illustrate the blindness that has to be healed in between. The travel narrative begins with a famous question that Jesus poses to the disciples: who do you say that I am? And Peter provides the correct answer. He says, you are the Messiah. And then Jesus informs the disciples of what this Messiah person what's going to happen to him. He says, then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Peter famously rejects this definition and is rebuked in harsh terms. Get behind me, Satan, is what Jesus says, for you're setting your mind not on divine but human things. The scene closes with Jesus gathering the disciples and a crowd and clarifying, at least in his own mind, what the gospel is all about. And he says, if anyone wants to be my follower, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life must lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it. The message, of course, is counterintuitive to say the least. Just as Jesus will, according to the gospel, save Israel by dying on the cross, so those who wish to follow him will only save their lives by losing them first. Jesus will predict the passion 2 more times in the travel narrative, at the end of chapter 9, at the end of chapter 10. And in both of these instances, the disciples are no wiser. So here we can see the first or the second prediction in Mark chapter 9:31. The disciples don't rebuke him here. It says they didn't understand what he was saying, but obviously they saw what happened to Peter back in chapter 8. They don't want to revisit that scene, so they don't ask him. And then in chapter 9 is the third and the longest prediction of the Passion. And then appended just after the prediction of the Passion is an argument between the disciples about who is the greatest. Another excellent example that they haven't understood who Jesus is, because who the greatest is going to be, of course, is who is the last. And the very actions and dispute that the disciples engage here in Mark 9 indicates that they have no understanding what Jesus is talking about. In sum, then, what we see in these 3 predictions is a terse summary of Jesus' own self-understanding and the utter inability of the disciples to grasp the point. True, Peter had attached the right title to Jesus' person, but both he and the disciples are ignorant of its content. Well, with this in mind, let's go back to the story of the rich young man that's embedded at the very end of this cycle. Very important to note. The story of the rich young man and Jesus' teaching about wealth is embedded in these stories that are about the content of Jesus' messianic office. I've already tried to make the case that the concept of a treasury in heaven is not a throwaway line in Jesus' speech. It's grounded in Proverbs 10:2 and echoes an important Christological theme in the Gospels. That is, if you want to prepare for the exigencies of the future, don't accumulate wealth, rather give it away. We can see why this proverb was so deeply beloved to the presentation of Jesus in these Gospels. But the rich man, as we also saw, was not able to bear this message. But important to note, the disciples as well, which shouldn't surprise us, also find the teaching difficult. And in these words, which formed the subtitle of Peter Brown's book, after the rich man leaves, Jesus turns to his disciples and says, "Children, how hard it is to enter the kingdom of God. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who's rich to enter the kingdom of God." So the disciples then here asked in amazement, "Who can be saved?" And Jesus responded, "For mortals it's impossible, but not for God all things are possible." What's striking, and this is key, about this interchange is the way in which it mirrors what's going on in the larger travel narrative. In other words, the larger travel narrative is about who is Jesus, and the counterintuitive way in which he's going to save Israel by dying on a cross. How's that going to work? The disciples clearly think that's a non-starter. And it's framed here in chapter 10 then, or comes to inclusion with the rich man who asks, "How can I get eternal life?" And Jesus doesn't answer that question directly, but another good argument that Proverbs 10 is behind this. He says the way to get eternal life is to give away all your wealth, which will give you the zechut, the merits to eternal life for which you desire. So the story of the rich young man is really what I would like to call a play within a play. It's like a Shakespearean side play exploring in short compass the issues that the larger play is discussing. That, I would like to suggest, is exactly what's going on in the story of the rich young man. It's a play within a play. In a short set of about 8 or 9 verses, we're seeing in this interaction between Jesus and the rich young man all of what's going on round about it. Peter, as we mentioned, thinks that being the Messiah of Israel is all about power and glory. Jesus, he thinks, will presumably shortly destroy the Roman enemies and the kingdom of God will begin. The disciples have signed on to this mission because they wish to share in the spoils the future king will then distribute. Try as Jesus might to alert the disciples to the fact that any promise of future glory is going to demand a death on the cross, he's not successful. And similarly for the rich young man, he comes to Jesus asking to be instructed about how to inherit eternal life. Jesus responds that such a reward will require giving up all his wealth. The lesson inscribed in Proverbs 10:2 illustrates the problem that besets this man. Eternal life will not come from human riches, only divine riches can bestow such a blessing. And the means of acquiring those divine riches is cruciform in nature. Worldly wealth must be renounced. Well, now we're prepared to answer the question I think that I opened with. Modern readers have found the story of the rich young man puzzling because of the promise of a reward. What about the altruistic character of this moral act that Jesus has enjoined on the young man? But this concern I tried to say about altruism foregrounds the horizontal character of the charitable act. The crucial dimension here is the subjective demeanor of the donor. But the shocking demand Jesus makes of the rich man is meant to recall what Jesus has already revealed about his vocation and that vocation of his disciples as well. In order to gain their lives, they'll have to lose them. Well, if you will grant with me for the moment that this issue of a play within a play works, then it should stand to reason that what Jesus says about the cross, we can then by extension say about worldly wealth and vice versa. In other words, if we would prefer that Jesus would say this, go sell what you own, give the money to the poor, and then come follow me, then logically we should also say this. Jesus is going to undergo great suffering, be rejected and killed, punkt. And then if you want to become my followers, deny yourselves and lose your lives. Punkt, period. Right? No reward there, no reward there. This is a play within a play. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? Well, though this might follow logically, I think we'd all agree that something is amiss. And why this syllogism is wrong is worth thinking about. It is true, if we look at Mark 8, according to the Gospel of Mark, that the cruciform life will be rewarded. But I think as every reader intuitively knows, the issue at stake in Mark 8 is not the reward, but the type of vocation that Jesus is proposing. Peter thinks that the way to be the Messiah is to go forth bravely, perhaps even brazenly, and grab what is rightfully yours. Jesus, however, inverts the paradigm. The way to embody the vocation of God's elect is to offer your life back to God, trusting that through this offering, one's rightful inheritance will be attained. And herein resides my primary point. The issue here is not how can I achieve greatness, but what kind of world is it that God has made, and how might I flourish in it? That's the metaphysical point. Or the eudaimonistic point, if we wish to cast it into the language of modern ethics. The presumption is that only when we've grasped what type of world we live in can we figure out a strategy for flourishing in it. The teaching then is as much metaphysical as it is moral. And so we have, I think, the answer to the question I posed at the beginning of this lecture. The reason that Scripture attaches a reward to charity is not so much to motivate the donor, though an element of that certainly remains, but rather to make a statement about the nature of the world God has created. What kind of stuff is it made out of, and how might I profit from the way in which it's been constructed? Now, all analogies limp, but let me try one more. My wife was once in charge of a swimming class for adults that included, in fact, it was made up entirely of individuals who had had near drowning experiences in their younger years. This naturally led to an extraordinary fear of the water. Now, anyone who's done a proper investigation of the physics of water knows that the human body is buoyant enough to float quite naturally on its surface. That's the capability of water. Anyone who's tried to float in the Dead Sea knows that salty water actually lifts you up even more. It'd be hard to drown in the Dead Sea. But in order to exploit this fact, of course, you have to be relaxed. And in turn, you must trust the capacity of the water to hold your body afloat. The more you fear the water, the more you tense up, and the more you tense up, the more you thrash about. The result, well, it's nearly impossible to come up for air. Because the students my wife taught had been conditioned to fear the water, they couldn't trust its natural buoyant capacity. They could grasp the physics of the situation on land, but a whole host of demons came to the fore when they entered the water. Knowing something and acting on that knowledge are two quite different things. And so I would like to suggest about the treasury in heaven. What stands behind this idea is a claim about the nature of the world. To the casual observer, I'm going to give away my Midwestern origins, the world is like the middle of Lake Michigan. Well, for here, we're brown, the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And the middle of Lake Michigan or the middle of the Atlantic Ocean can be a frightening and unstable place. There's a reason that the Greeks and the Romans revered the goddesses Tyche and Fortuna. But at the same time, there's a deep desire, I think by all human beings, to affirm that the world was made out of charity, even if it can't be affirmed. And that's why Jesus promises the rich young man a treasury in heaven. The point of the promise can't be limited to motivation. Its function lies elsewhere. In the long run, Jesus is saying mercy is going to trump all competitors. Why? Because that's the type of world God has made and governs by his providence. Charity, I'm suggesting then, is not simply about making things better on earth. It is that, but it also reveals something about the essential shape of the world God has made and how one might flourish in it. Certainly for Second Temple Jews, for early Christians, that was the driving interest in it, I think, and what separates ancient conceptions of charity from modern concerns. Now, some may be uneasy here and fear that I'm prioritizing a momentary feeling of pity, almsgiving, for example, for the downtrodden, over a more substantial and far-reaching concern for constructing a more just society in which the need for alms would disappear. Though such fears are commendable, acts of kindness, after all, no matter how virtuous, don't compensate for deep structural evils. But in the end, this perspective, I want to suggest, misses a crucial ingredient. For the deeper question to be asked is what funds our interest in social justice in the first place? From whence comes this obligation to help the poor as poor? It wasn't a virtue in Greco-Roman culture, nor is it esteemed by present-day libertarians, a philosophy that, of course, I'm sure many of you know, is alarmingly popular among the young. Do we have any guarantee that a concern for the poor will remain a commitment of Western cultures once this biblical background has fully receded into the distance? The sociologist Christian Smith, a colleague of mine at Notre Dame, has recently argued that the concern for the poor, so prominent in Western democracies, had its origins in biblical religion. Peter Brown's recent book has provided massive documentation of the truth of that claim. Though thinkers such as Immanuel Kant or more modern like John Rawls have made arguments for why secular societies should retain these values, their arguments, Smith maintains, always presuppose the moral virtues they wish to justify. This raises an alarming possibility. Absent the Bible's metaphysical claims about wealth, the nature of the world that God has made, will these concerns continue? Well, of course that's possible, and who knows what the future will hold. But Christian Smith suggests another possibility. Sociological understanding, he writes, suggests that beliefs and ideas require institutional resources to sustain. Values, categories, norms, and viewpoints do not operate like perpetual motion machines. Entropy is always at work. Alternative values, categories, norms, and viewpoints are always competing for adherence. In order for belief commitments, especially challenging and costly commitments, like Proverbs 10:2, to endure over time and space, they must benefit from institutionalized resources and customs to reinforce and validate them. Time and again in the historical record of cultural change, beliefs and values once prized have come to seem outmoded, irrelevant, passé, not worthy of allegiance. or on a slightly different frame, but to the same point, Yehuda Mirsky reviewing a book by Michael Walzer, who actually was my immediate kind of suite mate at NYU when I was writing my book on charity, had this to say in his review of Walzer's most recent book. Liberalism, like the notion of sovereignty at its heart, rests on a view of human personhood, sovereign, inviolable, sacred, whose historical origins are rooted in theology. Maybe that theology is just a myth, but it's a myth we seem to need and indeed can't live without. Whether liberalism can endure without those theological understandings and their normative claims is an open question. Walzer credits religion with tenacity in the face of secular liberal ideas. Perhaps, however, it is a form of that tenacity that allows secular liberal ideas to exist in the first place. In any event, returning to Smith and ending my lecture, for this reason, Christian Smith concludes, I suggest it's worth our reconsidering the necessary metaphysical and cultural bases of the moral facts and obligations to which we are committed now while they are still understood and practiced. Proverbs 10:2 and the story of the rich young man in the Gospels, I've tried to suggest, does provide the necessary metaphysical basis for an ongoing commitment to social justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Gary. And we're open for questions and comments.
Yes, Greg.
Thank you very much for the lecture. It's a little bit off topic, but I'm just kind of curious. How do you see that the Second Temple Jews saw these treasures? As figurative or as literal?
I don't like the opposition. So the Book of Tobit, I think, will show you the subtlety that's involved in the terminology. So the Proverbs 10:2 is cited twice in that book, though I think it's the leitmotif through the whole. I think I've mentioned before that I think within the literary character of the Book of Tobit, we see inscribed an idea that will, in rabbinic shorthand, will be that charity to the poor is ha-mitzvah, the mitzvah, right? So we have 3 moments of Torah teaching in the actually 4 in the book. Chapter 1 is where he tells us that he learned the centrality of sacrifice in Jerusalem from his mother, aunt, I can't remember who, but a woman in his family. Chapter 4, he teaches his son. Chapter 10 or 11, Raphael teach him and his son, and then he teaches his grandchildren, 14, and always charity is the key virtue. And in 2 of these, Raphael in chapter 10 or 11 and chapter 4, Tobit, the mitzvah is taught with a restatement of Proverbs 10:2. It's glossed in chapter 4 as tzedakah tatzil mimavet, and it will keep you from going into darkness, which is, a beautiful gloss because it's about Tobit's blindness. And in fact, we know from the book that it works, that Tobit, by virtue of sending his son off on this perilous mission, which my colleague Tzvi Novik has, nicely documented, alludes to the story of the Akedah in Genesis, and is a mission that Tobit's wife, for very good reasons, doesn't want him to go on, right? But it's a perilous mission, but not only does he come back married, wealthy, but he comes back with the goods to heal his father's blindness. I think of, when I read that story, the story of Jacob sending Benjamin in Genesis, where he's obviously very afraid to do this, but sending Benjamin gets him back not only Simeon and Benjamin, but Joseph, and Joseph is second in command of all of Egypt. It's like, wow, who would have ever imagined that giving up Benjamin could yield such a reward? Well, the same thing happens in Tobit. So it generates stuff, real rewards, right? And then what Raphael says is that he says this Tobit is a figure who stands in for the entire people Israel. Nicholsburg, I think, has shown this. And so Tobit uses in his Psalm of Thanksgiving at the end of the book his being raised from the dead here in its Hebrew Bible inflection, right? Going from blind to sight, from someone who looked like he would die with just one child to having, you know, a bevy of children and grandchildren, blah, blah, blah. He uses that, not simply to say, thank you, God, beat my chest for all you've done for me, but because you did this for me, you can do it for Israel. You can raise Israel from the dead, understood as returning her from exile. But what Raphael says is that what's supposed to be told Israel, this is a long-winded answer, I'm sorry, but you hit a button that, you know, is like, it is deep within my person. He says that, you know, tzedakah tatzil mimavet, and will cleanse you from your sins. And here the cleanse, it's important to note that both in contemporary Aramaic and in Greek means to pay off a debt. So we have this notion of sin as debt. But the reason why the proverb is cast that way is that the problems of the people of Israel are slightly different than Tobit. Tobit's a righteous sufferer. He doesn't have sins to be forgiven. Israel does. So there we can see that the work that tzedakah does in one book is different, but it does real work, right? In other words, you have to read those lines of Raphael against Daniel 4, where, you know, the tzedakah in Aramaic, your generosity to the poor, or michan aniim, the giving, being generous to the poor will redeem you. The proken is the Aramaic term, but it's translating Hebrew Gaal, which is, again, Leviticus 25, the notion of Israel in debt to their sins. So it's doing real work there as well. So that the treasury, you know, actually does do something. Is that your question? Okay. Yes, Yedida.
This is resonating with me with Yochanan Mafs's explanation of intergenerational punishment, and that children do get punished for their parents' sins if they continue in them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if the tzedakah tetzil mimavet works only for the person who gives the charity, or also intergenerationally, because the person theoretically is giving away wealth that would be inherited. So is it just for them, or is it also for those closest to them?
Right. There's a great question. I, again, refer you to my book. Everybody should at least buy my book. You don't have to read the book, but at least buy the book. That's not very charitable to say. But then, you know, I don't exemplify the virtues I teach. I'm trying, but I don't always exemplify the virtues I teach. I love the material, but I also realize I'm not equal to the material, right? So in any event, so what's the answer here? So what I try to suggest in Tobit, it's my reading. I think it's the right reading, but again, I'm not particularly humble. I'm not going to say it's everybody's reading, but the question is, Tobit thinks he's going to die in chapter 4. So, and actually Augustine raises this question as well, but it's a great question to ask. He tells his son that almsgiving will deliver you from death and keep you from going into darkness, but he's blind, right? He's blind. Like, how does this work? What do we do? It's an incredible stira, contradiction, right? You know, he's teaching exactly the opposite of what's happened from him. It puts you in darkness, right? We know that the angel was sent. It's precisely because, you know, he's such a generous person that the angel was sent to blind him. So how do we understand that? Well, here I was greatly aided by a discussion of Menachem Kister on the term acharit, both in Hebrew and Biblical Hebrew, Phoenician, and Ben Sira, where a man's end, his acharito is the term in Ben Sira, can mean where he is at the end of his life, but it also can mean what happens with respect to his immediate offspring. So a man will be known at his acharito. What does that mean? The Septuagint chooses the offspring element. So a man's life, his character will be revealed by the way what happens with his children. So I think that's the only way I can understand the seeming contradiction of Tobit 4, is that Tobit imagines, okay, it didn't work for me, but it's still true. This is a deeply Jobin chapter. And how is it true? Well, it will work for my son. That's why I'm sending him to retrieve this money, which his wife, for very good reasons, thinks is a ridiculous operation to send him on. But I think Tobit is sending him on this mission that is Akedah-like within the story, because he deeply believes this is true, even if it didn't work within the compass of my human life, and he doesn't have the option of resurrection for the dead. it still works in terms of the sense of his own identity, which isn't limited simply to him, but to his immediate offspring? I think that's a great question. I think that only by virtue of realizing that, inside of muffs, can you actually, and my own colleague, former colleague John Levinson, in his book on resurrection, makes a big deal about this, about what does resurrection from the dead mean in the Hebrew Bible prior to the notion of a bodily resurrection. And he in turn is dependent actually on a colleague of mine from graduate school, Robert DeVito, who wrote a great essay in Catholic Biblical Quarterly a couple decades ago on the understanding of the self in biblical Israel. And it's not the autonomy of the self. It uses very productively Charles Taylor's book on concepts of the self in order to get at that.
I wanted to ask about the story of the treasury and having a young man giving everything away.
Mm-hmm.
How would that have been heard by Second Temple Jewish writers? Would that have struck them as going too far, a little strange, or would it be totally resonant with them?
Okay, that I don't know if I have a great answer to that question. I think there's a lot of things that one has to keep straight in your mind as you look at a story like this, because it stands, you might want to say, at the crossroads of major structural change in Western civilization. So, Protestants worry about this story because it seems to suggest that, St. Francis of Assisi got it right and, the reformers got it wrong. I don't think that the story is imagining yet St. Anthony. I mean, I don't think it imagines this as an institutional response of how everyone who follows the gospel ought to act. I mean, I think what happens with St. Anthony, St. Francis, I mean, that you can see that that's a logical extension, but I don't think that's the primary interest of the story. I think what the reason why it's important to keep chapter 8 and chapter 10 stereoscopically aligned is just as in the early church, there's no demand that everyone become a martyr, but if it's demanded of you, then of course, that's the highest service you owe to God. So it's not demanded of everybody that they give up all their money, but that is the gold standard of demonstrating reliance on God. So I guess that's what I'd say. Now within Judaism, that's a different question. I happen to like Eliezer Diamond on this. I think within Jewish texts, early Jewish texts, I think this is an option, and I think, as Eliezer Diamond says, even within the Jewish writings, once you have this isur against it, it still has people doing this and being praised for it, right? So I would suggest that, probably in the second or third century I don't know. I mean, the best reason I can give, I can't improve on Eliezer Diamond, that within Christianity, in a culture in which celibacy is revered, there is a social context in which giving away all one's wealth is more easily managed than in a culture in which one has family and children to tend for. It becomes harder to imagine, how that action. But I guess the thing is, in chapter 10, of Mark, I guess what I want to suggest is I don't think this isn't like the cookbook for what everyone has to do to follow Jesus, right? But it's illustrating this, what I say is this larger metaphysical point, that the way that you get things is by giving things away, right? That's what's here. And then this story simply carries it to the farthest limit. Rob?
Yeah, so thank you for your lecture, and it's kind of stimulated my mind and thinking in a variety of directions. But one area my mind's going is I'm thinking of at least one or a few Jewish responses to the destruction of the temple, and one of them I think it's Avot de Rabbi Natan talks about without a temple you still have charity.
Right.
As one of the pillars, right?
Right.
And so this is kind of a thing that can generate or cause giving and kind of influence that. Of course, the Christian tradition has its own response to the destruction of the temple. But I'm wondering if you see any influence on the Jewish traditions and that kind of way of thinking on the Christian tradition, even though the Christian tradition deals with the destruction of the temple in different ways.
Well, the destruction of the temple within Christianity is a different matter altogether, and it's so bound up with the notion of the end of Judaism, a theme I don't want to go into this evening. Not a great theme of ecumenical interest, so not a happy day to pursue. But I guess what I would want to say, I don't know if this is exactly the question you are asking, but many people cite that text trotted out in every handbook on rabbinic Judaism, that this is a kind of post-70 innovation within Judaism. But that's why I think it's important to attend to sources like Ben Sira. Tobit, one could say, well, that's a diaspora book, so it's on the same wavelength. Maybe you would want to say the same thing about the Septuagint on Hosea 6:6, but you can't say that about Ben Sira, nor can you, I think you say that about, many of the texts within the New Testament itself, which are written and imagine a world in which the temple is still there. So I think within this period, charity has a prestige equal to that of the temple. You don't have to have the temple be destroyed, but once the temple's destroyed, of course, it derives new signification. This comes into Christianity. This isn't exactly your question, but this is the way I would take it, in the correlation of the act of almsgiving with that of the celebration of the Eucharist. Chrysostom famously says in many points that, in his homilies, you've met Christ at the altar this morning, referring to the Mass. Now go out into the streets of Antioch and meet him again at every street corner. There is a somewhat similar Jewish analogy here. The phrase that you find in the Jerusalem Talmud that evidently the paupers would say to affluent individuals, zechibi, acquire a zechut, that is, fund your treasury in heaven through me, as though they were the mode by which such contributions would enter heaven. So that they're like, I would suggest, walking altars. They're conduits that allow the individual to do not only an earthly act, but a heavenly act. And I think it's not the same way it functions within Chrysostom, but it's not wholly different either. It's a similar notion that there's the kind of sacramental sacredness to the poor person, and their notion as being this kind of access point for God. I think it's just hard. Moderns don't appreciate that, and that's what that painting we looked at way back at the beginning of my talk, which is I think 1600. It's amazing how long this is in Western civilization, but how thoroughly it's been lost in the modern world. 1400, sorry, not 16. Yes?
I was wondering if you could say more about the characterization of charity as the commandment and Torah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I guess I would say a couple of things. This is a kind of research topic I'm trying to pawn off on some graduate students. Haven't been successful so far. Might end up having to do it myself. I tried to pawn off the sin topic for years. When I was at Harvard, every graduate student come along, I would say, why don't you do this? But no one ever wanted to do it, so then I did it myself. But may happen here too. So in Ben Sira 29, he describes what unfolds in this chapter as, the end, probably as hey antole, but he doesn't mean the commandment. But the question is, where does this come from? And most people say, this comes from Deuteronomy 15. But I think what's very interesting about this is I think we carry a notion of commandments informed either by biblicist, definitions. It has to be something that Moses heard at Mount Sinai, or it's oral and written Torah like the Mishnah. But I think in Second Temple Judaism, what was considered a commandment is not been, given its due justice. And there's a dissertation, a very good dissertation on Tobit 4, and most modern scholars refer to this as a wisdom discourse. And I always tell my students that they've got it, backwards. This is a Torah discourse that's folded wisdom literature into Torah. And so I guess what I think about Ben Sira 29 is the right research question to ask: what biblical text does Ben Sira have in mind when he calls this a commandment? Or is the better question, this is where I would lean, is that we should expand what we think of as commandment in this period, right? It's not the oral Torah of the rabbis, but it's not just, the bare words of what Moses says. And the relationship of wisdom literature to, well, there's a lot more. I won't go on and on about that, but Kugel in a great article on reproach in Second Temple Judaism notes, he doesn't make this point, but if it's there, that wisdom literature provides much of the vocabulary for the mitzvah of how to reproach your neighbor you find in Leviticus 19, and not by accident, because the theme is a wisdom trope probably already in the Holiness Code. And as Baruch Schwartz has shown, I mean, the Holiness Code is a deeply poetically inflected, writing, not unlike Proverbs. Anyways, that's another matter. But so that's one thing I guess I would say with respect to that on the commandment. But the other thing I guess I already said, maybe I said it too fast, but I think the book of Tobit, which is one of my loves, is the book that illustrates that principle earliest. It's not a linguistic principle. It's not like, entele or mitzvah now has the meaning, the commandment, meaning charity. But I think inscribed in its literary form, all prestige of commandment keeping is on that particular one, right? So what that linguistic shorthand ha-mitzvah does is anticipated in the literary form of the book of Tobit. That's what I wanted to suggest. Is that your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's also part, I discussed this, the rich young man. New Testament scholars are always bothered by why does Jesus add the commandment of charity to the 10 Commandments? What's the relationship here? There's two ways to go with that. I mean, I think, one way is the one I've just suggested. Perhaps that's also an indication that this is really the commandment, which demonstrates, separates the girls from the women and the men from the boys, as it were. Or the other way to understand it is that, the previous commandments, which are all commandments, between Ben Adam uven hamakom, between, Ben Adam leven Adam, between a man and his peer, this commandment, understood the way I understand it, the way Ben Sira understands it, is a commandment between you and God, right? Looks like it's between you and a peer, but it's actually a commandment between you and God. And that could also illustrate, the gravity of this commandment. And on the basis, actually, going back to Proverbs 10:2 and the work this thing does, the other place where we have this raising of a person from the dead, which is understood in Tobit in its Hebrew Bible inflection, but New Testament scholars have uniformly missed this, but not the fathers, not Cyprian, not Chrysostom. In Acts 9, Peter raises Tabitha from the dead, and all New Testament scholars are going to say this is an act of Peter acting in imitatio Christi, because Jesus raises people from the dead, and now after Pentecost, Peter does. And that's true, that is a meaning there, but it's very important, and this is where the ancients saw this, and no modern ever sees it, is that the text says explicitly that she was assisting widows. She was a woman of great charity. So Cyprian says, God, he comes in the room, sees the widows there holding up these garments that Tabitha made, and she's ripe for raising. I can raise this lady. She's got, treasure in heaven. Boom, and up she flies, right? And if you look at the artistic portrayals of that action, I have one in my book, which you should at least buy and look at the pictures if you don't want to read the text. The artist fronts the clothing, right? I mean, the clothing looks like an actor. There's got Peter, and you've got her, but then you have the piece of clothing as though it's praying too, right? Because it is this, there's real work being done. The scandal of this, I mean, the question you ask is very interesting. I found this also in Greenblatt's book. This is why it's so scandalous, and this is why in the 16th century charity becomes, so abominable, because this is essentially the first slide here of almsgiving and Eucharist raising people from the dead, but here we mechanize it. We actually have a rope pulley. And so how do you tug on that rope? What's the tug that will actually get them out? Well, the tug here is almsgiving and the sacrifice of the Mass. They're equal in significance according to the painting, but that was like works righteousness. Like, who do you think you're God? You can raise people from the dead too? That became very problematic in the wake of the events of the 16th century. But I also think they animate questions. I'm not saying that that's where your question comes from, but I hear it frequently. I think there's just a modern uneasiness, right, with the kind of theurgic quality of these actions. How can this? Does it really? It must be just a metaphor. If you want to understand this image, it's not a metaphor, right? People gave money to the poor because they thought this is what eudaimonistic world. This is the way the world God made, right? If you want to flourish in it, this is what you do. So charity was a statement, I want to say, of faith in the character of the world. It wasn't just doing instrumental, actions the way we understand it. We offload charity into the sociology department, economics department, maximize benefit, blah, blah, blah. But what we see here is it's, a different gradient against which we read these actions. No? Yes, over here?
Yeah, thanks so much for this. I've worked in American religion in the 19th and 20th century, but this is really kind of thought-provoking for me. So my question actually is an invitation to say a little bit more about what you said at the end. I know this is about the Second Temple period, but you gesture toward the sort of present and future charity.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I was just curious, kind of what you see as you talk about Christian Smith's work and the sort of institutional contexts that are required to kind of perpetuate the logic of charity. So I guess what institutional contexts or practices do you see as particularly important? So church attendance, Bible, familiarity with the Bible, attendance in bookstores to buy your book.
That certainly will help.
What's the kind of where do practices of charity take place? And I guess I'm just related to this in thinking about kind of charity manifesting some ideas about this kind of vertical relationship, not just the horizontal relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I could thinking about how much charity, say in the U.S. now, is premised upon kind of horizontal incentives, right? Like tax exemptions and stuff
Right.
like this, 501c3 donations, which allow you to write stuff off on your taxes.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know.
This is all very interesting to me, and I have for me, the reason why I got into this in the first place is reading the secondary literature on the Second Temple Jewish material and the Gospels was you were just transported back to the 16th century. It's incredible. Even things written yesterday, these are deeply embedded phobias within, American culture. A part of it is reformational, but a lot of it is not. A lot of it is Kantian. So I've had as much problem selling these, my proposal to Jewish auditors as to Christian, auditors for different reasons. I don't get the works righteousness, but the altruism. I mean, I could give you all the, the standard reasons that are generally, come back to me as to why, this whole presentation was, maybe historically true, but not compelling. Of any admiration, we might want to say, from the listener. So I got interested in all of this because I realized in reading literature, actually a great example of this is Bornkamm, one of the greatest New Testament scholars from a previous generation. His little booklet on Lohngedanken, on being rewarded for good actions is just it's just an anti-Catholic diatribe. I mean, just all the way down the line. And he goes right to all the passages in the Gospels where Jesus promises a reward and stands on his head to show you it's not a reward, but it is a reward. But anyways, I just realized that, reading through this stuff, you have to, that's why the Greenblatt book was so good. You have to know what's going on in the mind of scholars, but you also have to know just what's going on in the mind of contemporary individuals. I mean, Charles Taylor's Secular Age is also very good. The kind of immanent frame, the way in which we understand the natural world as a kind of closed system of physical causes. So at the end of Paradise Lost, when Dante talks about the stars being moved by divine love, that's not, going back to Greg's question, that's not just a poetic, filigree. I mean, he really believes that, right? The world is motored by love, right? And that's what all of this is about. So how do you preserve that in the modern world? I don't know. I mean, like Charles Taylor, in many respects, as a modern person, I'm as secular as any unbeliever, right? We're all parts of the secular age. What is the prescription going forward that will preserve within Western civilization the values that instilled both secular and religious interest in the poor? I'm not a prophet or a son of a prophet. I don't know. I think it's still true. And my colleague another colleague at Notre Dame, who wrote a book that you're probably familiar with. I think it's called American Grace with Robert Putnam. And my Notre Dame colleague, unfortunately, I always forget, he's Mormon, a fine man. But they demonstrate through extensive surveys and study that religious people by significant margins give more to the poor, both in terms of cash and time, and not just, they correct for religious charities. It's not just religious charities, but secular charities. They give more time and more money, which is a striking datum. So it clearly you can demonstrate through social science that this is the case. I think the question Christian Smith wants to ask, it's the question Pope Benedict, wanted to ask of Western Europe as well. You want to, trash your Christian origins. Where will that lead? Is everything that the Bible brought forward, something simply to be, consigned to the ash heap and then, go forth without it? What will we be? I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's a question worth raising, right? And Smith is, comfortable with raising it. Yehuda Mirsky. Yehuda Mirsky's book is about Walzer's book, which is a study of the revolutions in India, Algeria, and Israel. So 48, 63. How all three of them began as secularist enterprises, but all ran out of gas in terms of what they wanted to achieve as secular operations. And Walzer looks at that and realizes that what he thought from the 60s about secular Yehuda, I don't know if it's Mirsky's term or Walzer's, but distinguish between secularization, which is a objective, documentable phenomenon. It's not either of them. It's Peter Berger's term. And secularism, which is the religion that only the secular is true. That secularism doesn't follow from secularization. And I think that's what Walzer observes in his book that treats the role of religion in contemporary Israel, Algeria, and India. And Mirsky's point is perhaps a little. I like Walzer, but he's good on religion. He's not great, in my opinion. Mirsky, I think, has a better grasp of what's going on there. But prognosis, what we ought to do. Then, unfortunately, I raised the flag. I'm a biblical scholar. I only talk about what happened 2,000 years ago. Michael Satlow's more recent than me. He talks about late antiquity. He's closer. So afterwards, ask Michael.
Okay. So with that, I want to thank you once again for that simulating presentation.